Hello, wrestling fans. Welcome to a special episode of 360 Wrestling Fanatic. I am your host, Lance Brack, and it is episode 316. Since it is episode 316, like I said on the last episode, right here on 360 Wrestling Fanatic, it has got to be all about Stone Cold Steve Austin. And that's the bottom line, as he would say. And I'm not, just a little kind of warning, I guess you could say, this isn't going to be a great, biography podcast or great documentary thing. It's just gonna be me, Lance Brock, talking about Stone Cold Steve Austin, since this is the 316th episode of 360 Wrestling Fanatic. So I hope everybody still enjoys it anyway. And I just want to start off from the beginning, or at least when I first really have heard of Stone Cold. I've heard a little, or Steve Austin, I should say. And it was way before the Stone Cold days when I first heard of him, a little bit about him in World Class Championship Wrestling towards the end there. And of course now I have seen some video footage on DVDs and his early stuff when he first wrestled at Stephen Williams, actually, a match. Him that was in the Sportatorium. It is Stephen Williams versus the Punisher. And in case you haven't seen that match before, the Punisher went on to be Mean Mark Callis, and also went on to be this character in professional wrestling you may have heard of before, The Undertaker. And there's some classic wrestling DVDs and stuff that had that match on it. And you might be able to find that match on YouTube. I'm not sure, but I definitely wouldn't be surprised at all. So, around that time, he was feuding with his trainer, gentleman Chris Adams, and then his wife, Lady Blossom. And then when I first actually got to watch him on TV on a regular basis was when he made his debut for WCW as Stunning Steve Austin, which, even as a kid, and he was a bad guy at the time, I was impressed by him. And even though he was going up against some of the baby faces or good guys who I was a fan of at the time when I was a young kid, I still kind of liked this guy anyway. He had some really good matches against one of my favorite all-time wrestlers, Sting, against Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, the Natural Dustin Rhodes. And then in his corner, Lady Blossom, they were married at the time. And then he would change up a little bit and team with Flying Brian Pillman to become the Hollywood Bonds. And like I was just saying, even though they were heels at the time, I liked the team. I thought just even as a young kid, I thought just the way their cockiness and their attitude was, and the way they worked together, I actually liked them. And they feuded with Ric Flair and Arn Anderson. At the time, Ric Flair had a talk show segment on WCW TV, Flair for the Gold, and this is a pretty famous segment in WCW history, actually. Austin and Pillman mocked it and called it Flair for the Old, which was kind of, at the time, really, you got to see, the first time you got to see the personality of one Steve Austin. And Brian Pillman, of course, was great in that too. And they were going great as a tag team, as the Hollywood Blondes. And for some reason, WCW, Austin has described it like they didn't really want them to get over, but they got over anyway on their own. So they split them up way too soon, which they could have been even better than they were. And Austin was in the stud stable managed by Colonel Parker, and then he was let go by WCW, which Austin has discussed many of times. And then he went to ECW, the land of Extreme Championship Wrestling. And then that's when Paul Heyman just let him be himself. He let him vent some of his frustrations with WCW, with Eric Bischoff, with Ric Flair, and he cut those promos on them. He referred to Nitro as Monday NyQuil, and he mocked Hulk Hogan. I think he might have mocked Macho Man a little bit there too. And he wasn't in ECW very long. Kind of feuded with the Sandman a little bit, Mikey Whipwreck. And after his time in ECW was done, he would go to WWF. And I remember I want to say maybe 12, I think. Still kind of young, anyway. But I remember watching Raw live at the time. So either Nitro was on a commercial or not, or what they had on wasn't as good. So, but I was watching Raw at the time, and I see the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, in the ring. And he was brought a new superstar in, and was going to make him the new $1 Million champion. And obviously, right when I saw him, I go, Steve Austin, obviously. But the name Ted DiBiase announces him as is the Ringmaster. And unfortunately did not quite get over, and it lasts for a little bit, not too long, but he does have a Caribbean strap match with Savio Vega, is which one of the maybe only highlights of his career as the Ringmaster. And of course, he does have some matches. I remember on Superstars and Raw, has some matches with Bob Holly and some other opponents. But like I said, that doesn't quite get over. And then he shaves his head, and then they're trying to come up with some new characters. He said some of the names they have came up with at the time were like Ice Dagger, Chili McFreeze, Fang McFrost. And this story has been talked about a lot of times on the DVDs and other documentaries. He talked about it in his book, The Stone Cold Truth, that he was at the house with his wife and she just made him a cup of tea, and she said, "You better drink it before it gets stone cold." And she said, "That's it. That's your name, Stone Cold Steve Austin." I don't know if that's exactly how she said it, but pretty much. And then right there, Stone Cold Steve Austin is born. And then King of the Ring, 1996. In the tournament, he has a match against Wildman Martino, more known as Johnny B. Bad in WCW. And then he gets kicked in the mouth, mouth busted, needs to go get some stitches, so he goes to the hospital actually, and he gets the stitches and then comes back. And another famous story, when he gets back to the arena, Michael P.S. Hayes, who was Doc Hendricks in WWF at the time, tells him that Jake the Snake Roberts just cut a religious promo on him. And then in the finals of the King of the Ring, he beats Jake Roberts and then becomes the King of the Ring. And then after, Doc Hendricks interviews him, and he comes up with that one of the most famous promos in maybe all of wrestling history. Definitely probably the most famous in his career. He just tells about Jake Roberts, how you come out here, talk about your songs, talk about your John 3:16, and he says Austin 3:16 says I just whipped your ass, and boom, that started it right there. They came out with the shirt, which was just a simple black shirt, and the white writing had Austin 3:16 on the front, and then on the back it had the Stone Cold Smoking Skull. And also 96, I believe it was, SummerSlam, he had the match with, or not SummerSlam 96, but speaking of SummerSlam 96, he was on the free-for-all with Yokozuna, and for some reason, that is actually a match. It definitely was not a long match at all against Yokozuna, and Yokozuna goes up in the corner to go for the bonsai drop, and the top rope breaks, and Austin rolls him up for the win. And then now get back to SummerSlam 97, I meant to say, and he faced Owen Hart, which he suffered a broken neck when Owen Hart tried the tombstone, but it was the sit down version of a tombstone, which is not like the safe version, I guess you could say, like The Undertaker does, where his knees hit first. And this is definitely no fault of Steve Austin at all, but probably the worst looking roll-up maybe in all of pro wrestling history. But like I said, he had a broken neck, so, and you can tell that Owen helped him with it. He fell back and let Austin pin him. And then, of course, there's the famous Pillman's Got a Gun segment on Raw. And the 1997 Royal Rumble. I know I went back in time a little bit there. One where it looked like he was eliminated, but the referees did not see it. And then he went back in the ring and then eliminated Bret Hart. Definitely one of the famous moments in Austin's career there. And then also winning it in 1998. And, of course, Wrestlemania 13. Definitely one of his most famous matches. Had such a bloody mess at the time, which was like a double turn, like really was when the face turn of Steve Austin started. Bret Hart had him in the sharpshooter, blood just dripping down his face, and that would become a famous picture. And in WWF history, Austin, they're bleeding in pain, and they even came out with a t-shirt where, just like the regular Austin 316 shirt, but Austin 316 was written on the front in blood, and then on the back of the t-shirt was that famous picture with him a bloody mess. And also at this time, I know I'm jumping around, please forgive me, but was the VHS release called Stone Cold Said So, and then I don't know if it was a year or so after that, maybe they came out with Austin 316 Uncensored. And another quick little story, I did not actually get the VHS at the time, or I didn't buy it anyway, but I do remember just a little bit after it came out, my dad took me to either Blockbuster or Hollywood Video, and we rented it. And I'm sure if there's any young wrestling fans listening to this now, they have no idea what a Blockbuster or a Hollywood Video is, where you go and rented VHS videos. But that's what you did back then. And I remember years later, I'm not really sure how many, I was at Walmart, and at that bin they have DVDs and stuff, and WWE ended up releasing it, and I mean it was only like an hour documentary, not like the DVDs they ended up started coming out with, where the documentary was hour and a half, maybe close to 2 hours, and then they had a bunch of DVD extras with matches and like interviews, stuff like that, but it was just mainly like the 60-minute documentary, and they had it like only $5, so even though it was like already been out for a while, I bought that definitely right away. And then get into 1998, Wrestlemania 14, taking on Shawn Michaels for the WWF Championship. Shawn Michaels Triple H and China were DX at the time. And for the match at Wrestlemania, Mike Tyson was going to be the special enforcer, so that got a lot of I guess you could call it mainstream press and publicity coverage from... At the time, there wasn't really a lot of wrestling coverage in, like, just the regular news or the mainstream media, but this got, of course, got a lot of it, a lot of ESPN, other news, like, channels, stuff like that. And this is, nobody will probably know what I'm talking about, but at the time, Comcast, they had, like, a cable guide, kind of like a TV guide, almost, but it was made by Comcast. You could get it in the mail along with your cable subscription. And I remember I kept that, and I had it for a long time too, actually. The cover, it was Mike Tyson in the middle of Stone Cold and Shawn Michaels. And I thought that was great because, I mean, of course I was buying all the wrestling magazines, Pro Wrestling Illustrated, Inside Wrestling, The Wrestler, and of course the WWF, WCW magazines at the time, but at the time I just thought it was cool because it was wrestling on a cover of a magazine that wasn't a wrestling magazine, and like Austin at the time was like, they had him and other wrestlers on the cover of TV Guide, like 4 different covers. I bought all 4 of them, and then the match, of course, Austin winning the championship, and of course this was the Attitude Era at the time, where pro wrestling may have been the most popular it ever was. And I remember back when I was a kid in school, there were other kids that used to say to me, because it seemed like at the time I was one of the, maybe not the only wrestling fan, but there definitely weren't very many in school at the time. And then I remember a lot of kids used to say to me, "Oh, why do you like that stuff? Don't you know it's all fake?" The usual, which I'm sure most wrestling fans have heard that before. And then went on to middle school at the time, like when the Attitude Era started, and then those same kids were showing up at school wearing Austin 316 shirts, they were wearing NWO shirts, DX, and they were acting like, "Oh, wrestling is so great now." But even though at the before they talked about how dumb and stupid it was, and then all of a sudden everybody loved it. And you can't do a podcast or talk about Austin without talking about his most famous feud, his most famous rival with Vince McMahon. Austin McMahon, definitely one of the most famous feuds in WWF, WWE history, pro wrestling history, and was talking about the VHS releases earlier, and they even came out with a VHS Austin vs. McMahon on the feud, and the cage match at St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where Austin, he knocked him off the cage and went through an announce table. The way McMahon landed on the table too was rough. And that was the debut of the Big Show, who just left WCW not too long before that, where he was the Giant. Of course, they called him Paul White. He wasn't the Big Show just yet. And going a little back again, of course, on Raw, the first time where Vince McMahon felt the Stone Cold Stunner. I'm sure a lot of people would agree. Vince McMahon probably took the Stunner worse than anybody at the time. I know some people talk about The Rock, how he kind of oversold it, how he flipped and stuff, but I actually like how The Rock took the Stunner. I thought he sold it like $1 million, how he did like the kind of backflip when he took it. And of course, speaking of The Rock, their WrestleMania matches, the first one WrestleMania 15, which was a good match, but Austin has talked about since then how he was going through a divorce at the time, having some problems, and he actually forgot his vest. So that's why he came out in the t-shirt. But Austin wins the WWF Championship from The Rock, and they have that great feud between them, Rock and Austin. Rock throws the Smoking Skull Championship off the bridge here in Detroit, by the way. And then their other WrestleMania matches at WrestleMania 17 in Houston at the Astrodome, where they turned Austin heel, had him join forces with Mr. McMahon, and unfortunately the heel turn didn't go quite too well, and so it didn't really last too long. But around, and also I'll get back to that in just a little bit, but also the third WrestleMania match between Austin and The Rock, WrestleMania 19, which The Rock, at the time, I want to say he already did the Mummy Returns and maybe the Scorpion King. Or I know the Mummy Returns for sure. They had that match, and then Rock and Austin, definitely one of his memorable feuds, and that was definitely one of his last real matches. And I know he had the one with Eric Bischoff, but I want to say that was a serious competitive match or anything. And he, of course, around that time, 2002 or so, is when he came up with What? And that started from a voicemail that he left to Christian. He called him up, left a voicemail on his phone, and then just after every other thing he would say what? And then that got the fans, of course, and it still goes on today when somebody's cutting a promo, and then if there's room in between their words, what they're saying, they say what, and every once in a while, he'll have like a smart way to counter it, but I don't think it's ever going to stop, to be honest. What chance? I know some people are kind of sick of him, but I don't know if I would really say I am, but it's definitely kind of old by now. And Also in 2002 was the infamous walkout. And yeah, he walked out before CM Punk did it, before Sasha Banks and Naomi did it. And he was like, again, like going through some stuff in his personal life, and they were going to have him face Brock Lesnar on Raw in a King of the Ring qualifying match. And they were going to have Lesnar go over with no build-up, no hype. And so he was not happy with it. And he left Raw, walked out, was gone for a while. And then he talked about how he got a call from Jim Ross, and he met up with him, and then ended up coming back to WWE. And he has admitted that he doesn't, I'm going to say he really regrets it, but he says he probably should have tried to handle it better instead of just walking out on the company. Maybe could have came up with a better idea or something. And then he was the co-general managers with Eric Bischoff. And then Wrestlemania 20, he was the special referee with the match Brock Lesnar and Bill Goldberg. And after that, he was done full-time, but would make appearances. And then he did do some movies. And speaking of acting, I just want to go back before. He, at the time when Austin 316 was one of the biggest things, he was on a bunch of different talk shows, and he was, a few times had a guest role on the show Nash Bridges, and I saw that because my grandma and grandpa always watched Nash Bridges every week, and they would always tell me when Stone Cold was going to be on, and then I would watch that episode. And he was on MTV, Celebrity Deathmatch, and right now, get back to, I don't remember for sure what year it was, but he had the Broken Skull Challenge on CMT. I think that went a few seasons in it. Actually, I mean, I've seen little clips of it, but I've actually never watched a full episode of the Broken Skull Challenge. I think that's what it's called. It was on, I know it was on CMT. And then he came out with the Stone Cold, the Steve Austin show, I should say, the podcast. And good show, I thought. Yeah, of course, had mostly wrestling guests on at the time, and then but sometimes he would have like other celebrities on, and good podcast, and not doing it right now, just airing like classic episodes each week. But I know he's doing other stuff, and of course, he does the Broken Skull Sessions with that's on the WWE Network and Peacock here in the United States, but everywhere else it's still the WWE Network. And even before that, though, before he started the Broken Skull Sessions, he did the Stone Cold podcast on the network with Vince McMahon, with Triple H, and of course Stone Cold's still very busy, and at WrestleMania he would actually have one more match with Kevin Owens. And he always said, when it was brought up, when he was asked about one more match, he always talked about it had to be right, because he didn't want to go out there and stink the joint up, have a bad match, leave a bad impression on all the fans and everything. But it finally, at the right place, the right time, I guess you could say, him and Kevin Owens. And of course, it wasn't just a regular wrestling match in the ring. They brawled all over. But for what it was, the kind of match that was very good, very entertaining. Austin getting the win against Kevin Owens. And they just had a great match. And that's about it for this episode of 360 Wrestling Fanatic, episode 316. And now I'll get back the next episode of 360 Wrestling Fanatic, talking about, of course, the current product, recapping the shows, talking about the current pro wrestling news. But this was episode 316. I had to talk about Stone Cold and make it a special episode. And hopefully everybody enjoyed it. Thank you for listening to this special episode. And it's going to be quite a ways away. We still got quite a while to go, but I am announcing it now that episode 619, 619, going to be a special episode all about Rey Mysterio, whenever that is. So, who knows, it could be quite a ways in the future, but episode 619 of 360 Wrestling Fanatic is going to be all about Rey Mysterio. And hopefully we'll make it to episode 619. Who knows when it's going to happen, though. But thank you for listening to 360 Wrestling Fanatic. And I hope to bring back the other 360 Wrestling podcasts that I will as well. Unleashed, maybe Watch With Me, Off Thursday, who knows. Hope to bring them back, do some more soon. And remember, you can, if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or anything else, 360 Wrestling Podcast at gmail.com is the email. Also, the podcast is available on YouTube as well. You can leave a comment with your question or suggestion, whatever you want to leave, there on YouTube, the YouTube channel of 360 Wrestling Podcasts, or any of the social media, 360 Wrestling Podcast, Twitter at 360 Wrestling Pod, Facebook and Instagram are just 360 Wrestling Podcasts. You should be able to search for it, find it on either of those. Also, if you want to support 360 Wrestling Podcasts, make it bigger and better than it's ever been before, you can. Don't have to, but it would be very appreciated, very nice of you to help out. And it'll help, like I said, make it better. There's two ways you can. Anchor.fm/360-wrestling-podcast360 and www.streamlabs.com/360 wrestling podcast. Any amount is definitely perfect, but just listening is great too. Or like, subscribe on YouTube or any of the websites you listen to on. But the main one you should listen to on is Spreaker. And just keep listening, keep watching when I do the live streams. Hopefully we'll be returning to the live streams. Definitely not an expert at Streamlabs, but hopefully I hope to figure that out more, learn it better, do more streams. And that's it for this episode of 360 Wrestling Fanatic 316. Thank you very much. I usually say at the end of it, I am Lance, and I am a wrestling fanatic. But of course, this is episode 316. So I gotta say, make sure to listen to the next episode of 360 Wrestling Fanatic, and that's the bottom line, because Stone Cold said so.